Let's return then to those problems sparked by migrants in Calais, desperate to get to Britain in the hope of a new life. They've raised serious questions now about how to stop the situation getting worse. So, is the answer better policing of our borders, or should we be taking a more proactive role in the countries they're fleeing? Let's discuss it then. Joining us now live from our Westminster studio is Tony Smith, former Director General of the UK Border Force, and Bidisha, author of a book called Asylum and Exile: Hidden Voices of London. Tony, if I can come to you first, what's gone wrong, who's to blame, and how can we learn from this?
Well, I mean, what's gone wrong is really a global crisis in the movement of people, and we've seen that particularly at the EU external frontier, with record numbers now entering the European Union across the Mediterranean through the Balkans, a huge movement of people into the EU, largely uncontrolled, and really, a reluctance from EU member states to take responsibility for processing all these numbers, a lack of capability, and given that, coupled with the lack of borders within the EU, clearly then that creates pinch points at the UK border in places like Calais.
And at Calais, would you say it's all about working with the French to secure that pinch point, or is it our problem?
No, absolutely. I mean, we've been in Calais now for about 15 years, and I worked in the department, it was then called the Immigration Service, before we got to Calais. And if you look back over the figures of the numbers that were coming through and claiming asylum, they were really significant, huge pressure on Kent. So strategically, it's really very important that the UK continues to work with our counterparts in France on what we call the juxtaposed control. So, we have got an opportunity there to secure the border. It has come under increasing pressure lately, and I think we're doing everything we can to work with the French to try and stop the problem.
Bidisha, can I ask you now, I know you favour a more humanitarian approach, and I think many people would agree with you, but in terms of border controls, what do you think would be the solution?
I think that we have to see this, as you imply, as a humanitarian issue, and so my response would be a humanitarian one. I would like to see all of the EU member states, exactly as Tony implies, pulling together and using their resources not for the militarisation and intimidation of these refugees who are, as we've all said, fleeing terrible conditions, but for better reception conditions, a transformation of the detention system so that people are not intimidated and feel as though they've been militarised or criminalised. At the end of the day, it is legal to seek asylum. That is written into human rights law, and it frightens me to see that we have these intimidation tactics going on. Yes, of course, there's a pinch at Calais because you hit a border and that's the English Channel, but the response has to be to see these people as human beings and refugees. This is not really about migration as such.
If we are talking about refugees, and we've seen some migrant profiling which has suggested probably 1 in 6 are genuine refugees from war-torn regions, the rest are economic migrants. We'll talk about those in a moment. But as far as the refugees are concerned, why, as you mentioned EU law on this issue, aren't they claiming asylum in their first safe port of call, in this case France?
I think that what happens is that we have a very punitive approach, and there are many reasons why you wouldn't claim asylum in the first place you go to. Yes, you can say, well, it's your duty to claim asylum in the first place you go, but there are considerations. Imagine that you are fleeing a war-torn zone. You go to a place where you can speak the language, where you feel that you have skills which are going to translate, where you can genuinely build a life. I think there's also a case, as Tony rightly says, that there isn't a cohesive response across the EU states to what to do with refugees. So you're being dealt with in very different ways. You're encountering many different levels of resistance and pushback and assistance. But I think that the thing we have to say really is, if you look at the UN's Refugee Council, 86% of all refugees are in developing countries. So this is not proportionally a crisis point, although in terms of the history, yes, there are more refugees than there were before. But to put it into perspective, in 2014, there were only 30,000 applicants for refuge and being recognised as a refugee to the UK, of which really only about a third were accepted. These are very small numbers.
Tony, in terms of refugees trying to access the UK, we're processing our refugee applicants wrongly and far too slowly.
Well, I mean, it is hugely resource intensive to process an asylum claim. And as I say, harping back to lessons from history, but I mean, if you look back at the asylum intake figures in the UK, it's about 82,000 in 2002. I can remember the pressure on the UK government at that time to process all of those cases. We do have a very fair system here. People are given the opportunity to present their case. There is an appeals process, and then there's a very difficult process involved after that in determining what to do with people whose claims are unsuccessful and removals. And so it's hugely resource intensive. So strategically, the idea is to control the flow or the intake, if you like, of refugees. But what we don't really do in this country is participate in UN programs to resettle refugees, such as, for example, the Americans will take 65,000 a year, who have been recognised by the UN as refugees already, and they will acknowledge that and accept them into the UK. But in terms of our own asylum intake, it only really applies to people who manage to make it here in the first place, and then they will get a thorough hearing. But we're still actually paying the price, you know, because some of the backlogs that were created early in 2002, 2003 are still being cleared up now. So the government is really quite keen, I think, to control the intake figures so that you know, we can keep on top of the problem.
Badisha, controlling those intake figures, this is a difficult way to phrase it, but what if UK citizens don't want any more immigration? We saw in the last election campaign that immigration was a huge issue. People are fed up with waiting for A&E departments to clear successfully. They don't have school places, there aren't enough houses. You hear this phrase, England is full, quite a lot. What if UK citizens don't want any more migrants or refugees? Should we ignore them?
I think that perhaps we should. I like your raft of arguments because, believe me, I've heard all of them.
Yes.
I think the answer is to smash some of the myths and the lies that exist very much in the media and at the sort of top level of political rhetoric about refugees and asylum seekers and migrants, all of which get conflated in together. As I mentioned, those very low figures, 30,000.
Well, these are people's real experiences. People contact us at Sky News and they tell us what their real life experiences are. We don't reflect our views, of course.
No, absolutely. And of course, that's what they feel. But there's a shortage of housing because the government is not paying money into building family housing. If you look at the houses that refugees and asylum seekers are housed in, we're talking about families, multiple families in one house. The lack of investment into the NHS is not because lots and lots of refugees, of which there are only sort of 15,000.
But our population has risen immensely because there are millions more migrants living in our community, and we need the infrastructure to support that, or not invite them here in the first place.
That's the thing. I don't accept any of that, and indeed it's not true. For all of those people who are worried about the idea that Britain is full, there are too many asylum seekers and refugees, they're taking from the state. Asylum seekers are not entitled to taking any money from the public purse at all. And all I would say is go onto the UN refugee website and everything will become clear. Because I think this is about scapegoating foreigners and people who are different and other from us, whose life stories we don't understand. It's understandable. That is human nature. And it tends to happen at times of domestic economic instability. But it's very ugly.
Badisha, thank you for talking to us, and thank you to Tony Smith, former Director General of the UK Border Force. Now, it's a comedy festival that's helped wannabe stars become household names.